I'm testifying for Salim Hamdan, but what I am testifying for is that Mr. Hamdan and all of the detainees that will face military commissions are entitled to a fair trial. And at this point in time, I have significant doubt that they'll get a fair trial, and that was why I was there to testify. I mean, I think that, you know, as the ruling turned out in the Hamdan case, the military judge entered a ruling that the things I said, the allegations I raised were true, and he ordered Brigadier General Tom Hartman, who's the legal advisor to the convening authority, to be disqualified from the Hamdan case because of him exerting unlawful command influence on me and the prosecutors. So I think that's what we've got to get rid of. If we want to have a trial and call it military justice, then it's got to be a fair trial.
Air Force Colonel Morris Davis, he was the former chief prosecutor at Guantanamo, who resigned late last year. He now heads the Air Force Judiciary. We'll be back with him in a minute.
There's a farmer in a distant country working on the land. A hat upon his head and a shovel in his hand. Till the soil, plant the seed, wait while, cut the leaf, and send another cup of tea to me. I'm a spoiled child of the great imperialist state. I cannot kill my meat nor grow the food upon my plate. I never walked a mile to the well when the tap runs dry to tell what will become of you and me? What will become of us? Who will give us trust? Will you believe me when I say I never loved, profiting from your pain, that I felt shame when I looked the other way? Woke up this morning, the revolution knocking down my door. Those capitalist pigs, they don't live fair anymore. Slipped out the back door into my car. How far can you drive? How far? There's a farmer in a distant country working on the land. Food turned into flowers for the
singer-songwriter Simone White performing her song Great Imperialist State here in our Firehouse studio. As we return to our conversation with Colonel Morris Davis, the former chief prosecutor at Guantanamo Bay, I asked him about a newly released government document that suggests officials at Guantanamo tortured Salim Hamdan by depriving him of sleep for 50 days.
I'm not familiar. I think I read the same article you were just referring to that talked about the sleep deprivation. I don't recollect ever seeing that before. And I guess it's similar. I testified last in the Jawad case, which you may have read about, where the defense alleged that he was subjected to what they call the frequent flyer program, where for a period of weeks he was moved from cell to cell on average about once every 2 hours and 50 minutes around the clock. And again, I wasn't aware of that either. So it appears that there are some things that are documented that the government has access to that are just now coming to light. My view is you've got to know pretty much everything there is about the case before you swear charges and take it into court. In the middle of trial is not the time to be learning what the facts are, and that appears what may be happening in this case.
Do you think sleep deprivation is torture?
I think it can be. I mean, again, defining torture is fairly easy until you try to apply it to specific facts. And I think you really have to look at the specific facts and the impact it had on the individual. But I think it's possible for sleep deprivation to rise to that level.
I wanted to ask about the call for you to testify before Congress. At the time, Jim Haynes saying that you should not testify. What was his response when you were first ordered to?
Well, I never heard it from him. The folks over on Capitol Hill from Senator Feinstein's office that had asked me to testify called me a couple of days before I was to appear and said the Secretary of Defense office had notified them that I was ordered not to appear and to testify. Which again, I think, if you've read the news accounts, the Department of Defense has repeatedly denied things that I've said, despite, a military judge now finding as fact that the allegations I raised were true. And I've repeatedly offered, from the time I resigned in October through December when I was invited to testify at Senator Feinstein's hearing, through my testimony here recently at Guantanamo Bay, I've said repeatedly, if Jim Haynes or General Hartman or Ms. Crawford or anyone else has any disagreement about my version of the facts, I'll be more than happy to take a polygraph to verify what I'm saying if they'll take one to verify their version of the facts. And so far, no one has ever taken me up on that offer. So my commitment has been to tell the truth, to try to do what I can to ensure that the trials are fair. And it appears there have been a number of efforts to keep me from having an opportunity to tell the truth.
What other efforts?
Which again is, if you've read what the Secretary of Defense has said lately in the firing of the Air Force Chief of Staff and the Air Force Secretary, he said military officers have to have the courage to speak blunt truth, and that the services need to be a little less thin-skinned and accept criticism and find fault and be willing to address it when it comes to their attention. And I think that's what I've tried to do in this case, is to tell the blunt truth, that if you're going to wrap this under the banner of military justice, then it needs to be a fair trial. And what's taking place now I would call neither military nor justice, and that needs to be fixed.
Colonel Davis, did you have any interactions with, or were you pressured by the Vice President's office, by Vice President Cheney, by his Chief of Staff, David Addington?
No, I never had any contact with the Vice President or any member of his staff.
Let me ask you about the June 12th Supreme Court decision that said these Guantanamo prisoners have to have their day in a civilian court. The 5-4 ruling, marking the third time in 4 years the Supreme Court ruled against the Bush administration concerning the rights of Guantanamo prisoners. President Bush was in Italy. He said he opposed the decision. Your response, Colonel Davis?
Well, I think it was a monumental decision. Again, if you go back and look at the chronology, when the Boumediene case first got to the Supreme Court, if you recall, the Supreme Court declined to hear the case. It was a couple of months later that they reconsidered, which I think that's the only time in my lifetime that the Supreme Court on their own has reconsidered and agreed to hear a case it previously refused to hear. And I think what you have to look at is what took place in the interim, and that was when Lieutenant Colonel Abraham came forward, who was a member of some of the CSERTs that met at Guantanamo Bay, and he described that in some cases the evidence was flimsy. In other cases, when the outcome wasn't what was desired, they just kept doing, they would have a redo until they got the right result. And I think that caused, and again, I certainly have no personal knowledge, but if you just look at the facts, it appears that the Supreme Court, when they denied the case early on, they were willing to give deference to the executive branch. And it was only after these new allegations came up that suggested that maybe this process wasn't as robust as it had been billed, that they reconsidered. So my take on their decision is that it shows a lack of trust in the executive branch to ensure that the folks detained are getting a meaningful review on whether they're being properly detained. My personal opinion is I think the decision's wrong. I don't believe the detainees, that foreign terrorists whose only connection to the Constitution is a sincere desire to destroy it, have constitutional rights. So I disagree with the rationale, but if the result is it causes Congress and others to focus on the issue and come up with a rational result, then I can live with the rationale if it gets the right result.
Jane Mayer's book came out this week, The Dark Side, and among her revelations is that the Bush administration revealed warnings from the CIA 6 years ago that up to a third of the Guantanamo prisoners may have been imprisoned by mistake. In 2002, a CIA analyst concluded that many of the prisoners were essentially bystanders who had been swept up in dragnets or turned over to the U.S. military by bounty hunters. What is your response, Colonel Davis?
My personal knowledge extends to the 75 or 80 that we intended to prosecute, and those were cases where our investigators had combed through the evidence and we had a belief that we had reliable evidence to prove their guilt. So I never really dealt in depth with the other detainees that were outside that group. I mean, I think certainly there have been some cases, the Uyghurs are probably a prime example, that there was no evidence they had any hostile intent towards the United States. So what percentage is, were truly innocent, I don't know. I can tell you, though, the 75 or 80 we intended to prosecute, I personally reviewed the evidence, and I think we have ample justification to detain them and to prosecute them.
Do you think Guantanamo should be closed?
Well, it's a tough question. Personally, years ago, I used to be a bail bondsman, so I've seen a lot of jails here in the United States, and I think there are American citizens that are incarcerated right now that if they could see the conditions at Guantanamo Bay would be a little upset with their conditions. The prison facilities at Guantanamo Bay are based on existing U.S. facilities.